Witness the power of Gawa. No, my game's up. Fun's over. Quietly now. This isn't good.
Okay, so I decided to make a Yelan guide or FAQ, and I got quite a few questions this time, so let's go through them. First question was someone asking for a soft stat goal similar to what I did with the Nilu guide, and by that you're obviously referring to something like this, but unfortunately, to be honest, I don't think I can do a soft stat goals for Yelan, mostly because her builds almost entirely depend on what team you're playing, and things like her energy recharge really varies a lot. I hope this is sufficient, but instead I think I can just show you a few of my builds and use them as an example. So here's a generalist build with Favonius Warbird. This is a free-to-play weapon and it gives energy recharge to her and the team. It's an example of what my build might look like here. Something like 190 energy recharge, which is Favonius Warbow and only just 2 substats on energy recharge with the emblem set. I would say a build like this can pretty much fit 99% of the teams that you would play her in, especially because I know a lot of people play her in double hydro teams, and in those her energy recharge requirements are not going to be above 200. These are what my artifacts look like on her. It's a HP sands, and these are decent pieces. These aren't amazing pieces, mostly because I have to share my emblem pieces amongst all my other characters, so these aren't the most insane artifacts, but it's a decent goal. And then if I want to switch to aqua simulacra in the same sort of teams, I can just change my HP sands to an energy recharge sands, and that'll put me almost around the same energy recharge, and you get a pretty decent crit ratio and about the same energy recharge, so this is still playable. If I want to play her in a more main DPS kind of role, like say for example a double hydro team like this, or even a mono hydro team like this, then I would switch to something like this, around 140 energy recharge. And what I would usually do is just switch Xingqiu to Sacrificial Sword, and that makes low energy recharge builds like this very playable. So in these low energy recharge teams, that would be just me switching back to HP sands. And then just one more example, if you're playing a team that needs a lot of energy recharge, say for example like a solo hydro team, maybe a solo hydro team like this where you're using Sino or Al Haytham as the last slot, then you can just use Favonius and the energy recharge sands, and that would put you around 240. This is obviously a lot of energy recharges. These solo hydro teams with Favonius are probably still very playable with around 230, 240, so these builds are still quite fine. But yeah, these days I'm mostly playing her with a build like this. Again, don't expect insane crit damage like this if you're not using aqua, but these kinds of artifacts, stats like this, are maybe a decent goal. Whether these are achievable or unachievable, I guess that's down to you, but hopefully that covered the question enough. Okay, next question. It's got quite a lot of thumbs up. You mentioned that aqua outperforms elegy on Yelan in many situations. Could you cover in which and by how much? Okay, unfortunately, I hope you don't mind, but this isn't something I'm going to be able to give you an exact number on, just because, especially with Dendro teams, like hyperbloom teams, a lot of team calcs are not the most applicable to most players at the moment. There's a lot of assumptions in team calcs, especially in Dendro team calcs. But what I can tell you though is that, say for example, even in a Hu Tao team, even though a lot of people think because Hu Tao does all the big vape damage that elegy would be best in slot, but actually, say for example, in a team like this, we would generally say that aqua and elegy are about the same, if not aqua even slightly better, depending on your investment levels. Obviously, if your Hu Tao has got a lot of investment, like she's got C1 with Staff of Homer, maybe just for a 9-second DPS window, elegy might be better just for the bigger numbers on Hu Tao. But even in a team like this that uses lots of reactions, the main reason that aqua can be similar or even slightly better is because Yelan can add some more flexibility to the team. I can give you some examples. So this gameplay is from LWK, a speedrun I know. And this example isn't the best example just because I'm pretty sure his Yelan is C2. But if you can see the general concept that because Yelan's damage is invested, like she has aqua and she's built for damage, it allows you to defeat one set of enemies without needing to switch to Hu Tao. Obviously not everyone will have this kind of damage, but it's a good example because if you think about it, Hu Tao has about a 9 or 10 second DPS window, And if you have to use it to finish one set of enemies, and then by the time you go to a different set of enemies, her elemental skill expires too early, then you're kind of just left with not that much damage. A good comparison could be if you think about like the typical Raiden hyper carry team. It's probably like a 9-second damage window where these two do almost your entire team's damage. You have so much damage in this 9-second window, you might defeat one set of enemies, but by the time the next set of enemies spawn, you basically have about 11 seconds of your team's rotation where you do basically no damage. Basically, if I can sum it up, boosting Yelan's damage, and the damage is almost constant throughout your team's rotation, as opposed to almost focusing everything on your very short damage window. It allows for a lot more flexibility in your teams. Another team, and you might actually be quite surprised, again, I can't show you calcs on this, but even in the double hydro hyperbloom teams, maybe like this or a team like this, you might think because it's hyperbloom and it uses EM that elegy will be very good on Yelan. In the majority of speedruns that use these teams, they actually do use aqua. For example, I think this is 3.2, they were using aqua, and then even in 3.4 they were using aqua as well. Again, I know this one also might be quite hard to believe, especially because a lot of the team's damage is in hyperbloom, and it's not like Yelan is getting buffed by Kazuha. I think one of the factors might be that elegy buff doesn't actually have a lot of uptime. You can see it's 12 out of 20 seconds, and a team like hyperbloom, you know, there's no snapshotting and it's a lot of constant sustained damage. Like I said, you can't snapshot elegy buffs onto one character and have a very high damage window, especially if your characters have a lot of EM already, and you can even get buffs like Nahida's buff here. It can make it so that 100 EM for 12 seconds has quite a lot of diminishing returns. So that could make sense for me. Maybe elegy can be as good, but if you think about it, even in a team like this that uses EM a lot, that elegy isn't necessarily an upgrade of aqua, then you can see how in a lot of other teams why aqua would be better than elegy. And again, this isn't something I can really calculate just because, as I said before, team calcs, especially Dendra team calcs, are not the best thing to go off of. Now, having said that, I wouldn't be surprised if elegy is better in maybe a team like this. Shinobi benefits from EM, Nahida benefits from EM, and even Sino because his damage also scales with EM. You can see here that Yelan's ER is quite high because she only uses 1 E and the rotations are pretty tight. I'm not going to focus on the damage here, but I can see in a team like this. I could probably also see in a team like with Al-Haytham is very similar to Sino in that he also has lots of EM scaling. Although even in a team like this, I'm pretty sure with Al-Haytham you can use Yelan's skill twice per rotation. Yeah, you can see in the sim they use it twice per rotation. These are my own calcs. A team like Mono Hydro, obviously you would never use elegy in these teams. Aqua Simulacra in this team is a 40% upgrade. It's a huge upgrade in teams where Yelan doesn't do reactions and in teams where Yelan's energy recharge requirements are very low. In general, for most teams, I'm pretty confident in saying that Aqua Simulacra is either a side grade or better. And again, I wouldn't be surprised if teams like Sino Hyperbloom or Al-Haytham Hyperbloom, where elegy is as good as Aqua Simulacra or even slightly better. But for the most part, I would definitely prefer Aqua Simulacra. Okay, another question is some ER breakpoints in her most popular team. So energy recharge requirements. So here's an energy recharge calculator with a Hu Tao double hydro team. About 170 ER with a favonius weapon on Xingqiu. This sounds reasonable. I'm sure I'll cover this in the video, but you should in most teams be using her skill twice per rotation, which means use her skill about every 10 seconds. This is what keeps her ER requirements very reasonable and not something like 250 or 300. And there's very few teams where that is an issue, mostly if your DPS uses more than 10 seconds of field time. Like for example, if you're playing her with Sino, or if you're playing her with Shao, or maybe if you're playing her with Wanderer, I can see you're only having time to use 1 E per rotation. But yeah, if you're using her in a solo Hydra with Favonius in a team like with Sino, see this has 40 plus 60 plus 20 plus Cyphos. So yeah, I could see you needing to go a lot higher, maybe 230, 240 energy recharge on her. I just did a rough calc for a double Hydra Hyperbloom. This seems quite low. Okay, if I feed her half the particles to Nahida, it sounds more correct, yeah, around 160. And then also give you like a mono hydro version where You can see the energy requirements are very low in these kinds of teams. Like with no Favonius weapons in the team, 150, and if you have Favonius on Yelan, it's 120. Basically, in a triple Hydra team like this, energy recharge requirements are very non-existent. Another team, like a Raiden team, like Raiden, Kaza, Bennett, Yelan, I did roughly, and this sounds about right. Raiden generates a lot of energy for the team, and even without any Favonius weapons, it's about 108, 190. Even with one skill, which sounds about right. You can see even is putting a Favonius weapon on Kazuha, and it gets even more manageable than that. But overall, you're seeing a familiar theme here, which I can basically summarize. A lot of teams, when you're using her skill regularly, you want about 170 to 190 energy recharge to be very comfortable. Then you can go to around like 140 if you're playing her in a mono Hydro team. And then teams where she's a solo Hydro and you're using her skill only once per rotation, even with Favonius Warbow. Like for example, maybe a double Geo team with Yoimiya, a Sino Hyperbloom team. Those sorts of teams, you can maybe want around 240 with Favonius Warbow. But on the plus side, Favonius Warbow gives 60 energy recharge. You also get 20 from the emblem set, and you get an extra 50 from your sand. So even with barely any energy recharge substats, if you have Favonius, energy recharge sands, and the emblem set, you already get within that range anyway. So honestly, overall, I would say she's quite easy to build regardless of the team. Another question, and I'm just going to mix this in with another question, which they're basically asking about HP stats and how close they are to crit stats. I think it might be easier to show this on a sheet. But you can actually get to a point where you have a lot of crit, at which point HP stats can be similar to crit, and it can come down to what's the better piece you have, especially because HP pieces are more common than crit pieces. So even if HP is technically slightly worse, you might have better substats on it, which makes it overall better. Okay, so let's look at an average build with about 20 liquid substats. If I add one crit damage substat, it goes to 550. Instead, if I add one HP substat, it goes to about 550. So slightly less, but it's almost the same. Now I'm sure if I were to change the entire circlet, so if I remove this, it's at 417, but if I add a HP circlet instead, and this does mess up the crit ratio a bit, so if I can balance it a little, with this crit ratio with a HP circlet, it's 509, and then with the crit rate circlet, it was actually 539, so the crit rate circlet is about 6% better, which is about 3 substats overall. So yeah, you can see me changing that from 8 to 11, so now this is what I've got. Or even I can change it to a crit rate, I can do this to 15. So just with 3 more crit damage substats, it's basically the same. The HP circlet becomes about the same. And even if I change that to 10 and add extra crit rate substat instead, it would be slightly better. So yeah, I hope that covered the question. Okay, next question. You once mentioned that double electro hyperbloom performance can compete with double hydro hyperbloom as a topic. Yes, that can be true. It can even sometimes be better. For example, there was a Spiral Abyss last year where Quicken reduced opponents' defense by 35%. And in this Abyss, double Electro, for example, so this is a double Hydro team, and actually a double Electro team might look like this, or like this. So with a blessing like this, which lowers opponents' defense, obviously that helps Quicken, and reducing enemies' defense doesn't help Hyperbloom. Then double Electro can just be way better than double Hydro, but usually they can be slightly similar. Maybe double Hydro is slightly better than double Electro, but double Electro's main advantage is that Fishy was just really good in a team like this, and what happens is with double Electro, you generally get slightly less Hyperblooms, but you get more Quickens. And if your team has good artifacts, good weapons, it's pretty good investment. Then whether you have more Hyperblooms or more Quickens, it's not a big difference. It can be about the same. But that's why, for example, you could use a character like Sino instead, and his double Electro team can be pretty good, and you wouldn't need to force him in a double Hydro team. I've always thought Xingqiu Yelan double Hydro is such a strong duo. It is a strong duo. I would say for general content, a double Hydro team is maybe slightly better. I would say one of the main advantages isn't even maybe necessarily damage, but it's that her elemental skill gives you repositioning and flexibility. Especially in a lot of Hyperbloom teams, they don't have grouping, so that can be quite significant. You can also more easily vertically invest with Yelan compared to Fischl. You can get her signature weapon, you might be able to get some constellations. and that can boost double hydro's potential quite a lot. In comparison with Fischl, you know, once you use Oz, although she is pretty flexible, you have to just reposition it to different enemies, and that can be quite annoying. So without a group, a team like this can sometimes be more scuffed than double hydro, but it's still pretty good, especially because these are 3-4 stars with nahida. And yeah, you do mention using beta in your hyperbloom team, and actually that's a good example because a team like this was very popular in the previous Abyss cycle. High damage reduction stacks with Xingqius to make this team a lot more tanky. This team had a very high usage rate in 3.8. Next question, is Fav Bow with emblem good enough by itself to cover ER needs in any team? Yeah, I kind of covered that in the team ER requirement section, but Favonius Bow by itself gives about 60 energy recharge, then the emblem 2-piece gives 20, which means you get 180 by default without even needing to get energy recharge stands. You can see I can use this, and if you ignore this 14%, I would have 180 energy recharge by itself, which, as we covered in the team section, is about the ballpark for a majority of teams. Remember, that's as long as you're using an E every 10 seconds, or basically twice per rotation. So to answer your question, most teams, yes. Another question, how impactful is her C2 and is it worth getting if you have a C1? Okay, just for context, I have a weapon, but I don't have the constellations. To be honest, this might be a hot take, but her C1 is more relevant than her C2. This is kind of just more damage, which is useful, but a lot of people think about her C2 in terms of it opening up more teams with its more hydro application, but there aren't actually many teams where it's that relevant. And just before I get into this, a lot of people might think of it in the other way, in that her C2 actually ruins some teams with hydro application, and that is basically never true. A lot of people might think if you're playing a quick bloom team and you get her C2, it gives you more hydro application, so you get less quickens and you get more hyperblooms. Like I said before, more hyperblooms and less quickens just evens the scale out. It doesn't really make that much of a difference. And then this just boosts Yelan's damage, so it's just more damage overall. So one of the only real teams where her C2's hydro application can make a difference is, like, for example, a solo hydro Hu Tao team, something like this. But actually, you can play this team at C0. A lot of people think that you need C2 to be able to play a team like this, but you really don't. So a C2 in that case, it just adds slightly more consistency and just more damage on Yelan. But I'll show you an example on how this team like this is very playable. It's actually a misconception that a team like this without double hydro is unplayable at C0 Yelan. Let me start here. So you can see, although I got hit, I managed to vape every single hit, even with Kazuha infusing Pyro there. Yelan burst, Bennett Q, Kazuha hold E. You press N1 and then E to wipe the Pyro aura, and then it's completely fine. You can lose some vapes here and there, but it's very playable and it's definitely not unplayable. And the other thing is, if your Hu Tao is well invested, a lot of enemies, they will just die with a few vape charge attacks anyway in a team like this. So you're rarely going to end up in situations where enemies have Blood Blossom and that applies Pyro, and then Hu Tao applies Pyro, and then you start losing vapes. How viable is on-field Yelan? Very viable. Of course, I'm sure, as most of you know, if once you get her C6, she becomes like one of the strongest DPSs in the game, period. But even if you're at C0, even if you just have aqua simulacra, if you're not a big spender and you do want to play on field, you can easily play on field with like a mono hydro team like this, or you can do like Yelan National, where you forward vape per skill and then help Xiangling do a few vapes after. You can play a team like that. You can maybe think of this like Yelan hyper carry. I would say that if you're playing this team, that you probably would want C1 just because then you can get 2 nukes. There are a few questions asking if it's worth like putting a Yelan constellation, if it's worth putting aqua simulacra. As usual with my channel, I don't really give pool advice, since that depends on your account, how you play the game, how much gems you got saved up, if you like horizontally investing and collecting lots of characters, or if you want to vertically invest in her. I would say though that aqua simulacra is very strong on her, and C1 is very strong both for exploration, as you said, and in combat. So if you do have the primos, you can get that. But yeah, it's your decision. Can she be considered somewhere between Kokomi and Xingqiu in terms of bloom team single target versus multi-target? First of all, I wouldn't really compare her and Kokomi, just because the most popular bloom teams use this team as the core, and then you'd either do double dendro like this, or you do triple hydro like this. You can obviously replace Kokomi with someone like Kirara, Yao Yao or Baiju, but usually because this 3-man core is so popular, you would, if you are going to play Yelan, you would play on a triple hydro team. But I would say yes, that Kokomi generally is the best hydro for multiple opponents in blue teams, because Kokomi's jellyfish has just a lot of AoE and she heals at the same time, so she gives a lot of roll compression. Generally, the most flexible bloom teams like double dendro teams like this, and then a triple hydro team can be slightly more single target, I guess, if you wanted to make that comparison. Since her E cooldown doesn't start after the E cost, it's actually possible to maintain a 20 seconds, 21 second 2E rotations over at C0. You can see the cooldown doesn't start immediately, it starts after you let go of the E. So yeah, you are correct. Generally, it's more like 21 seconds. But yeah, I wouldn't really worry too much about that 1 second. That would make more of a difference on spreadsheet calculations than in practice. You won't really notice that 1 second. Can you make C1, C2 guides for Vape teams? I don't have her constellations, but I can show you how to do a Vape setup. So I haven't got Bennett on instructor, but that would be slightly better. But I'll still show you how it works. Basically, you use Yelan's Q, then use Bennett's Burst, then Kazu's Hold, and that double swirls, and then you can just use Yelan's there, and you can see. And then you can just do the rest of your team setup. If you're playing like Shungling, you can use her Burst. Can you go over how to build her when you get a C6? You see some different takes. Oh, so this is a good question. And just to preface this, I don't have C6 myself. I'm still at C0, but I have played it and I'm familiar with it. So I do kind of know what you're asking, and that's because in some guides you might see that they recommend emblem at C6. Basically, a lot of theory crafting, when you're doing constellation calcs, you will have like one rotation and then you measure the changes in that rotation's damage as you get more and more constellations. And the main issue with that is it doesn't factor if constellations change your playstyle. And in Yelan's case, her C6 makes her do a lot more damage with her breakthrough barbs and her elemental skill, and you're a lot less reliant on her elemental burst damage. You'll see in a lot of C6 Yelan showcases that the enemies die instantly with your C6 attacks and your elemental skill, and they won't survive enough for you to get a lot of these burst attacks off. And that can be a big difference to her C0 gameplay, where you're a lot more reliant on her burst. Even if in a theoretical rotation, you can still gain a lot from emblem at C6. In reality, most of your damage is not coming from her burst, and that's the reason why like a 2-piece hydro, 2-piece HP, those are usually her best in slot at C6. Like I said, you don't really do full rotations with higher constellations, and the shorter your rotations, the less relevant her burst damage is, which means emblem gets less relevant, although it's still pretty good because you still do need some ER and you still are doing burst damage. Generally, if you watch C6 gameplay, they'll be using the mix sets. Is she playable with Aqua as a solo hydro? If yes, how much ER? Well, this really depends on the team and how much energy you're generating in the team, and if you're using her E once or twice per rotation. So you should probably check out the other sections that covered energy recharge requirements. But yes, she is definitely playable with Aqua Simulacra. And I will use this time to combine this question with this question here, kind of, where it says considering Favonius is the best weapon in terms of utility and flexibility. Obviously, Favonius is a really good weapon, especially because you can get it for free and it generates energy for Yelan and for the team. And obviously, Yelan is a HP scaling character, so she doesn't care about base attack, which is why Favonius is really good on her. But I have noticed that it sometimes goes too far, and I know that a lot of people want to save people money and they don't want to hype up 5-star weapons. Unless you're playing a team where Yelan does so little damage and she maybe needs like 300 energy recharge, the aqua simulacra is always going to do more damage than favonius. In the majority of teams you're going to play, it's not even going to be close. Aqua simulacra might be a small upgrade over favonius, the higher energy recharge you need. But also, as I showed you in mono hydro, in teams where she doesn't need much ER at all, it's a 40% increase. So that 40% can drop to maybe 20% or even 15% if you need like 240 ER. But I'm pretty sure it's never going to get to the point where favonius is more DPS than aqua. Like I said, I think that's people just going a bit too far and hyping up the free-to-play weapon a bit too much. Obviously, a favbo can be very comfortable in like if you're playing in a Sino team where you're only using a 1E, or if you're using like a Yoimiya double Geo team where you're only using 1E. But even in those teams, I'm pretty sure if you can generate enough energy in your team, and even if you do have to run like 230, 240 ER in order to use aqua is still going to be more damage overall. It just might not be as big as if she only needed 160 ER. But for the other part of this question, C1 or aqua, and then another person also asked how worth it to get is C1. Obviously I don't have it myself, but C1 is very good. It's obviously really good in exploration just because Yelan is a very good character in exploration, and having more uses of her skill allows you to zoom around faster. It can also be good if you want to use her as a main DPS, especially in a Vape team, because getting 2 charges basically gives you 2 nukes. And then there's also the fact if you are playing a team where she only uses her skill once per rotation, like for example maybe a Sino team like this, because each rotation this will charge up twice. So in teams like this, C1 can drastically lower her energy recharge requirements. Does C6 Yelan unlock any new team for her? This is actually a good answer. Yes, C6 Yelan is a team by herself, and C6 Yelan is very popular as a speedrun character. You can do Vape teams like this. If you have Nilu at C6, you can play her like that instead. You could also use C2 Klee if you have her instead of Xiangling. You could also use Bennett instead. You could also just play mono hydro teams. I don't have Ayato on this account, but you could use some mono hydro team and like Ayato as a second DPS. I would recommend watching a lot of other people's C6 Yelan gameplay because she's almost like a different character at that point and it's hard to sort of cover in a guide. And the last question is C4 Yelan benefits. Just as a disclaimer, I have C0, but her C4 gives HP to the party, and there's some obvious benefits for this. For example, in Hu Tao teams, you can buff her damage and Hu Tao's damage. And then there's also Nilu Bloom teams where you're boosting the whole team's HP. That can obviously boost Nilu's HP, which boosts the team's reaction damage, and it can boost the team buff you get out of Nilu's signature weapon. So those are 2 main ones I can think of. Obviously there's quite a few characters in the game that scale with HP, like Zhongli scales with HP, Kokomi scales with HP, Shinobu technically scales a bit with HP, Kivara. Yeah, the main ones are probably like Hu Tao teams or Bloom teams. So yeah, I think that does it for the Yelan FAQ/guide, and hopefully you found some stuff useful. Maybe there are some things you disagree with or agree with. But anyway, thanks for watching.